Hello and welcome to stories read by Philip Ballerscheff and also written by Philip Ballerscheff. This one is Trial and Error. If you'd like to subscribe to the blog that I read these stories from, there's a link to that in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Edna's life was a series of discoveries. When she was barely 3, the wind shoved her off balance. She looked over at the other side of the street to where the wind had been. It was gone. What she saw were construction workers repaving the asphalt, whom she observed without a glint of understanding in her eyes. Her reaction was like that of a young child when it discovers electricity. Why speak so generally, so abstractly about something that also happened to her? It was Edna, after all, who had at 7 taken a fork to an electrical outlet, seen sparks fly, and then had to be taken to a hospital by her worried parents, who the doctors later patted on the arm and said she would recover well enough to learn her lesson. There was no need to punish her any more than nature already had. When the wind blew her over, her parents took her in hand, waiting until they calmed her down to explain what had happened. Part of that explanation was who was at fault. The wind came and went, and neither it nor she could be blamed. At that age, this was what her parents tried to impart. Nothing about the exchange of hot and cold air or what a storm was. When she stuck a fork where it didn't belong, her parents again waited until she recovered to explain what she had done and why she shouldn't do it. She didn't know, and now she did. Next time she would be punished, they said, but there would be no next time. Edna had cured her curiosity as far as electricity was concerned. If they'd had a boy instead of a girl, her mother said, he'd get into a different sort of trouble. She was imagining just what that might be, maybe falling through the ice while ice skating, or shooting at small animals with a BB gun, when her husband saw fit to disagree. Boys can get shocked just as well as girls can. They can, but would they? That's what I'm after. Not if it's possible, but if they'd really do it. I don't know. Should we go back to the hospital and ask the maternity ward for 100 or so babies to test on? No, 10 will be enough, she said, her annoyance at being made ridiculous creeping into her voice. I just wanted to be safe. She kept imagining a son. He let it go for his own good. Through trial and error, Edna discovered the world. This was her parents' way of teaching, letting her face the consequences that arose naturally from her actions. She could turn her head and refuse to eat what they made her. That was her choice, but she was responsible for the hunger that followed. Still, they kept her from serious harm. There was no need for them to get angry at her, to yell or plead or hit, though sometimes in their frustration they did so anyway. The world was there for her to explore. How much she understood and how quickly was up to her. Discussions about parenting were odious to them. They had their own problems and didn't care to hear about other people's. Whenever some friend wanted them to, in effect, console them about their troubles, Edna's parents talked about their method of natural consequences. Once they had put the idea out there, it was everybody's choice to do with it as they pleased, to adopt or dismiss it or take some parts and not others. I said before that Edna's life was a series of discoveries, but everyone's life is a series of something. No, not just one thing that's repeated till death, but many more things than that, and with interruptions in between. I define her life by her discoveries because they were often memorable and because her parents recounted the ensuing falls, bumps, bruises, and mishaps to guests. Not mockingly, but as something that had happened to her the other day or the day before that. Oh, she looks grumpy, someone might say. Her father would nod and explain how it came to that. That's why Edna herself, at least for a while, began to think of her life in these terms, though all her parents intended to do was to make conversation. Whatever befell her, it was almost never far enough into the extreme end of any adjective that could describe it. Hard, sharp, wet, cold, hot, dry, high or low, to really hurt her. For example, while exploring the grounds of their then new house, Edna found a lake and fell in. She was taking in the house's outside, inspecting it with the same attention that her parents had given its interior during the house showing. She wandered ever closer without noticing it, ever closer until she had to notice it. Not any more by the sight and sound of it, with her eyes and ears, but by the water she felt soaking her skin and her clothes. As if the world were a sterner parent than her own two, the sun disappeared behind the clouds sooner than she thought it would. It was late afternoon, close to evening. It was dark when she got out of the lake, and getting darker. She ran home, arriving just before the sun was completely gone. Water dripped down from her dress and onto the floor as she came in. Her mother ordered her to wait on the welcome mat, the one inside the house, until she could get a towel. That last part was what stopped Edna from feeling hurt. If the order was cruel, there was at least a reason for it. Edna begged her mother to hurry, and she did, but had she hesitated, Edna wouldn't have known. She had no estimate of how long it should take a woman to go from one end of a house as big as theirs to the bathroom at the other end and head back to help her daughter. However quick her mother was, to Edna the wait was an eternity. She dried herself and wrapped the towel around her waist. Her mother told her to take a shower. What's done is done, but you can stop it from getting worse and hope for the best. The dress clung to Edna's skin as she peeled it off, which was uncomfortable, but no more than keeping it on. At first, even the lukewarm water was hot to her. She tested it gradually, getting closer and closer as she got more and more used to it. She stayed under the water until she was warm, and yet, after all that, she sneezed when she came out of the shower. Edna was laid up with a cold for days. From Wednesday to Monday nobody saw her at school. She thought it was a fever, but the thermometer proved her wrong. Just as well, she thought. She wasn't that sure about the difference anyway. Guests heard her sneeze from her room to the living room right next to it. She heard her parents and Mr. Gaines talking, and contemplating the ways it could have gone, was grateful she didn't need to take an interest in someone who meant nothing to her. She and her parents treated her sicknesses and injuries like baby pictures. Her parents discussed them as they would anything else, and Edna stifled her embarrassment when they did so. Edna sneezed again, a sneeze that jerked her head forward. Though she didn't mean to, and would be embarrassed if she knew it, she had become something to talk about, just as a heat pipe that coughs or a vent that rattles demands attention from those who hear them. Questions of when the problems began and how much time and money it might take to fix them will soon follow. Her parents explained what had happened to her, sparing no detail they knew. "Oh," Mr. Gaines said, raising his eyebrows well above his glasses and bunching his forehead in surprise. "Well, I hope she gets better soon." This was a statement that would fit on a department store card, the kind he would have bought for Edna along with a present, had he known of her sickness in advance. But what else could he say? He had already touched on his son's rudeness, and they in turn had already told him to let his son suffer the consequences of his actions. What consequences? He and his wife forgave him too soon for him to feel anything, to suffer anything. Maybe his son felt a twinge of guilt, but if so, it wasn't powerful enough for Mr. Gaines to see it. Should they put on an act of being offended that their son, their own flesh and blood, whom they had fathered and mothered and otherwise cared for, that he no longer cared for them? That was ridiculous. The act would fall through right away. How else, then, he asked himself, should they punish him? Or rather, how would his son end up punishing himself? Well, he would hurt his reputation, something he didn't yet care about. When he did, his father feared it would be too late. But there was still time, Mr. Gaines thought, for him to act and for his son to change. Just how he would do it, he wasn't sure. Advising someone younger than you and to whom you were related was a careful business, one he would have avoided if he could. His son's friends stuck by him no matter what he said, and Mr. Gaines had heard him say some awful things, especially when they came by to pick him up before going into town. That's how they greeted each other. Swearing was new and shocking to them, and so they made a game of it. Without the slightest hint of anger, they spoke of faults and perversions that he would be too embarrassed to mention, even to those who really were so unfortunate and so afflicted. If he ever met such people, he would have pity for them, not use them as weapons against his friends. Mr. Gaines had done a good job of keeping his son in refined circles, where the harshest disagreements were still articulated in full sentences, and the reason for argument was more substantial than the personal insecurities of a teenage boy. He blamed himself a little for the rebellion, he reflected, which must happen eventually in one form or another. This was better than the worst his son could do, drink or do drugs or get into fights. They weren't harassing anyone but each other, and only with words. If it was any worse than that, he didn't know about it. He had alluded to all this, his hopes and his fears both, during his attempts to get advice from Edna's parents. Some of it he had admitted directly, an exceedingly rare thing for him to do when visiting them, since he knew how they would answer. Why bother? Why, indeed, Mr. Gaines asked himself. He drank their coffee and used the silence they gave him to think some more. He was a large man. That much was clear when he put a hand to his cheek so he could rest his head, but Edna and her parents had known him for so long that his size was no longer remarkable. Whether such a man cowers or stands tall, the facts of his height and width remain. What changes is how he handles them. Mr. Gaines reclined in the armchair beside the sofa which his hosts were sitting on. They weren't bad friends. No, not if you knew how they were. Set in their ways, they believed you'd only do things differently if you didn't know better. His son was fair game, his interests and worries and whatnot. But why, in their minds, should they keep talking about problems that had solutions? Well, fine, Mr. Gaines thought, striking back against something they had never said, but only implied by refusing to discuss what was bothering him. Then they would sit and enjoy the silence, he decided. And so he did, quite unself-consciously, too. He wasn't there to entertain them. Each word of this sentence fell so heavily from Mr. Gaines's mind that for half a second he believed he had said them aloud. Had she known this, Edna would have wished that all his thoughts could be so quiet. He was always going on and on about his son. If he had a daughter, he didn't complain about her often enough for Edna to know. Sickness made her sensitive all over. She had drawn her curtains. Although there wasn't much light to block out, there was still a little. She wanted none. What about the noise? She put her jackets and sweaters against the crack under her door, the same crack through which light came in from the living room, thereby circumventing the curtains over her window. For the same reason, the sound of traffic was less of a threat to her peace than the quiet conversation taking place much closer to her. Thank God there wasn't a game on. Win or lose, the honking would have been too much for her. Edna climbed into bed, pulled the blanket over her head, and tried to sleep. This darkened what she saw and dampened what she heard almost totally. Her room couldn't disturb her now. Only the people outside her door could do that. Her parents brought up something they had read in the newspaper the other day. Really, they said that exactly. We read something in the newspaper the other day, and while they tried to remember more, Mr. Gaines smiled furtively, amused that they could remember reading, but not what they'd read. Who was it? Edna's father asked, turning to his wife. Mitchell? Macmillan? I usually like his columns. No, no, his wife said, now facing him. She listed some names, and then some letters she thought might be the author's initials. Bored by their hesitation, Mr. Gaines grumbled inwardly that he wouldn't read it anyway. He didn't read newspapers, and they wouldn't give him an old article or fish the whole paper out of the trash for him. Would they? No, of course not. So what did it matter? What was it? He prompted, cutting through the confusion and making them look at him again. Some scandal, Edna's mother said, but it was more how they said it than what they said. She promised to call him when she remembered. Edna had continually gotten used to silence, only for it to be broken by a remark not worth bothering her over. When their guest finally went, with a loud, inconsiderate good-bye, no less, Edna waited through the ensuing silence yet again, believing it was temporary. Her father approached her door and was about to whisper good night, when her mother told him not to disturb her. She's sleeping. She won't hear you. He agreed it was better that way. Edna heard all of this, even the sound of her parents shutting the door to her room when they went to bed. To return the favor of receiving him as a guest, Mr. Gaines called them the next day and invited them over to his house that weekend. Edna, too, he said. Her parents made her go. He had asked for her. After calling them, he called Rebecca, who wanted to come but wasn't sure if she could. Well, he asked, how does it look? She would be there, just had to make arrangements. Had she said what those were, Mr. Gaines would have gladly helped. And how have you been anyway? Good, she said. Good, he said. I talked to the Hellmans. They're coming too. That'll be nice, won't it? Oh, and their daughter Edna's sick. I didn't ask what it was, but you could hear her all through the house. Well, it's good we got everything figured out. Bye now. That's how the story of Edna's sickness spread. Not all who knew passed it on, though most did, and why shouldn't they? The old kept her in their prayers, the young kept her in their thoughts. For all that they worried, whether on their knees or on their feet, Edna was blissfully unaware of their efforts. Edna's mother still hadn't called him by the time the week ended. Mr. Gaines wondered if this meant she hadn't remembered the scandal, or if she had forgotten her promise. Maybe it was both. His only interest in the matter was to imagine these possibilities. He had no plans to develop them further, whether theoretically by outlining the likelihood of each and the conditions they depended upon, or practically by asking Edna's mother if she remembered their conversation of the scandal. Saturday came, and after dinner, the Hellmans went to their party, or by asking Edna's mother for a definitive answer. Saturday came, and after dinner, the Hellmans went to their party. Edna wore a white dress with blue and purple flowers on it, which she couldn't name. Her parents dressed classically, as her mother said, meaning traditionally, a suit for him in black and white, each color where it belonged, and a modest tasteful dress for her. Edna tried to follow what streets they took on the way there. She wasn't good with directions and soon gave up. Instead, she looked at everything that passed her by, some of which was stationary, like the hedges and the way they gleamed in the sun, and some of which moved, albeit not in the direction they were going, like the cars that came up on the other side of the road. Mr. Gaines opened the door to let them in and then took their coats. Shoes off, please, he said, and because he was so nice about it, they complied. A woman saw them and took Edna's hand before saying how good it was that she was well. The mass of furs she was wearing moved with her. Her words were indistinct, as if she had no teeth and had to speak with her gums. Edna didn't look into her mouth to see if this was so. The woman's age was beginning to show in her face, particularly in her thin, wrinkled neck. Edna thanked her and wondered if she was Mrs. Gaines. No, the woman was too old and Mr. Gaines was too young for that to be true. He didn't act like he knew her very well either. The woman might be an acquaintance, or else Edna had misjudged her. The woman went away. Edna waited for more people to come and comfort her. At first she hoped they wouldn't, so she could keep to herself, but she felt disappointed when they didn't, as if she hadn't suffered enough to interest them. She didn't make a scene, except in her head. The other guests, all of whom were adults, had their own business to attend to. Her parents said she could go play on her own or stay with them. It was clear to Edna that they had a preference, but not what it was. They told her they would meet her at the main door if she got lost. Mr. Gaines's son was nowhere to be found. Neither was the man himself. His guests had all left whatever children they had at home, all except for Edna's parents. She asked herself why her parents made her go. The answer came in just as the question went out. Because Mr. Gaines wanted her here. But what did he want with her? She didn't know. He had tried to make it easier on her parents, who would have otherwise had to hire a babysitter or get someone to do it for free. She had never had to think of such things, so it couldn't have occurred to her how others would deal with them. Adult after adult took glass after glass from the trays set out for them. Before Edna could do more than notice that is, before she could even think to imitate them, not that a girl of her age would want to, her parents made sure she didn't. They warned her and explained which drinks were for the adults and which were for her. If you're not sure, it's best to stick to water and juice, her mother said. Edna thought back to Mr. Gaines's son, whatever his name was, and wished he were there so he could tell her about the things his father accused him of, and so she could tell him, if he didn't know, what his father saw in his future. Maybe he could teach her new swears. She imagined what they would just say to each other, but there wasn't much to draw on. She didn't know how old he was or what he looked like, so how could she have spotted him if he were there? Maybe he was, but how would she know? His father had talked about him as if his age, appearance, and all the rest were so well known that they weren't worth mentioning, just as Edna's own parents didn't needlessly repeat facts about her, facts you could see for yourself more quickly than you could hear them from others. She stood alone beside the other guests, watching Mr. Gaines and the wrinkled-necked woman talk. The woman had shed her furs to reveal the black dress underneath. Where was Mrs. Gaines? Standing over her, Mr. Gaines looked impressive. He had a manner that fit his build, that gave it something to do. He gestured as he talked, as if his arms were coaxing the word out of his mouth. He was telling her about his father, a devout Protestant, a Unitarian to be exact. The woman asked what the difference was between denominations. If he were a Catholic, he'd be a priest, and I wouldn't exist. The joke made her nod and smile at having understood it, not laugh as she should have. Edna fought the urge to find her parents and ask them when they would be going. It was just a short drive from their house to the Gaineses, which meant she was stranded here for the time being. How could she endure this boredom? Her simple lament became a question she needed to answer. This party wasn't like the days she spent in bed. Then she was too weak to want to move or to think much. She was tired and could easily, unwillingly, slip away into sleep. None of these escapes stood open to her now. She searched for something to do. The adults moved aside if they noticed they were in her way. She went around them if they didn't. She explored their house just as she had her own home on boring afternoons, going through her parents' rooms for anything that might interest her. What she found in the Gaineses' bedrooms were books of all sorts, mostly hardcovers. Their tops, not the covers, but the tops of the pages were dusty. Edna took each book out one by one to brush them clean with her fingers. She cleaned the shelves too, sweeping the dust out from the far corners and into her waiting hands. She wiped her hands on her dress, then wiped her dress clean with her hands. A cheer came from the living room. More followed intermittently. Cheers, shouts, things like that, big expressions of simple emotions, those got through to her. To say something more complicated, people spoke no louder than necessary to rise above the general noise of the party. Some of the dust fell on the carpet. They had carpets everywhere, even here. Why? To hide the dust? Not with white carpets. To get a laugh out of giving people electric shocks? Mr. Gaines preferred telling jokes over that kind of comedy. Their bedroom, like the rest of their house, was sleek, white, and minimalist, a style Edna hated with all the passion of someone who has no taste or training in any art, and instead uses their instinct in these matters, as I suppose most people do, including most of the educated, who have better reasons to explain their feelings, but are just as incapable of changing their minds as if their hearts stand in the way. Her interest in their library was personal, not literary. Someone had once said, as someone always seems to have done, that you could learn a lot from what a person reads. Bent, stained, and otherwise damaged pages indicated carelessness, prolonged or momentary. Yellow pages meant age, and that wasn't something she could fault them for. She ran her hand down a cloth bookmark that had a split end like a tassel, then craned her neck and saw that it was a thesaurus. The cover was a white crisscross of lines on a blue background. Nothing Mr. Gaines had ever said made her suspect he used it often. Had she been older or simply better read, Edna would have had more concrete expectations for a private library. She could have guessed at what books like A Realpolitik Approach to the Middle East were about. By chance, she might have read a book they owned, and could then have wondered what they thought about it and how that compared to her own thoughts. Seeing a hardcover classic, and then another, and then another, she would have been able to form an opinion about the Gaineses that went beyond their ownership of these books. That, for example, they had ideas about what was worth reading and what wasn't. She judged them as best she could by their books' titles and covers. The Gaineses' library was too broad to be easily sorted. It included expensive classics whose covers were paintings or other such fancy designs, cheap drugstore self-help books, stacks of newspapers, assorted non-fiction that their favorite talk show hosts pushed on their audiences, and books on parenting for all stages of life till adulthood. Mr. Gaines had either bought them in preparation Mr. Gaines had either bought these last books in preparation for raising his son, uh, or had at some point felt uncertain about his ability to do the job and looked to someone with qualifications uh, for advice, someone like Dr. Jack Carville, who had condensed his degree in education and years of study into a handy 200 pages per book. She studied Carville's diagrams, and yet these remained only possibilities, without evidence for or against to give them form or to make her prefer one over the other. Which came first, the boy or the instruction manual? She didn't think to check when the books were published. Whatever filled their shelves, it might not be on their minds now. It might not have been on their minds when they bought those books either, assuming they had read them, of course. Maybe they had the Oxford Companion to Philosophy because they'd once wanted to educate themselves and they'd never gone past the introduction, or taken more than a sporadic dive into whatever section seemed the most interesting from a 10-second glance at the table of contents. Maybe she was being too harsh. The Gaineses could read, but without conversation to give their books life. They were nothing more to her than objects to be looked over, like their beds. Edna tried to guess which was his and which was hers. She couldn't tell. Their empty nightstands were no help. These distractions proved so effective that Edna lost track of time. There were no great-grandfather clocks in the house or church bells nearby to divide the hours with loud tolling. Nor was there an alarm clock, silent except for the ticking of its fastest hand, anywhere in the room. When she realized how late it must be, she hurried back to the main door. But first she had to push through the crowd again. People gave way, but more slowly than before. It took them a moment to understand what Edna wanted and another moment to do it. Of course, a young woman slurred as she stepped aside to give Edna more space than she needed. Edna thought she was being sarcastic. There was a stain on her leg. "Are you all right?" Edna asked. The woman looked at her with eyes so blank that Edna could almost see her thoughts turning from the girl in front of her to the voice she had heard to a joke that was by now an hour old, and making a full revolution finally back to the girl. "Of course," the woman said again, relying on the word that was nearest at hand to get her through this conversation. The mood was looser. Nobody had the energy to be uptight or to be anything at all, other than what came naturally to them, which after so many drinks and so many hours spent together was to find some place to sit or stand and say things not worth remembering. Edna felt similarly. It was past her bedtime. Her parents were waiting for her, as she had feared, but they weren't angry. "There you are," her father said, giving Edna her coat as she got within arm's reach. He and her mother looked as elegant as they had hours ago, something Edna thought must be quite a feat if none of the other guests had managed it, though not all of their failures were equally bad. Some of those with ties or jewelry had taken them off and stayed sloppy as they sobered up, holding what they'd worn in their hands for safekeeping. Some had lost them altogether, and in their panic thought they'd lost their shoes too. Her parents left as they usually did, on their own terms. None of this thanking the host for the evening nonsense. Mr. Gaines knew how much they liked him. Anyway, it would be hard to see him among so many people. They could always call him tomorrow and use Edna to excuse themselves. Edna thought it best not to talk about what she had done. They might praise her for fixing a problem that wasn't hers, but she was too tired to receive praise now. Little lights illuminated the path from the Gaines's front door to the driveway where Edna's father had parked. Guests who'd arrived later than they had a longer road to walk. The night made the world smaller, cut it down to what was right in front of them and in the sky far above, where the stars were bright enough to shine through. The Gaineses didn't notice that anything had changed the next day. Without taking stock of the state of their bedroom beforehand, they couldn't have. Sunday passed and Monday came. Edna went back to school. The sun was stuck between the clouds. Its light spread out in the gaps and made their clouds' fringes glow, as if they could burn. She had forgotten her cold and was surprised when her friends asked how she was doing. "What do you mean?" They reminded her. Their parents had heard about it, they said. Her fall into the river had been a short, cold shock. Her recovery and her wait in the Gaines's bedroom both took much longer. It was only now that she realized, as her friends told her, what she had missed while she was away. That was trial and error, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to subscribe to the blog that I read these from, you can find a link to that in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe.